this is a field, we're talking about radio, that has been declared dead I don't know how many times. But it is through the sheer force of the talent and the dedication and the bringing of the two together with ever-expanding opportunities of technology and a little bit of resources for the grease, that we're still here and growing in ways that never would have been predicted even 10, 15 years ago. So just to reintroduce myself, I host a television show and a radio show, and it's now a podcast, that's called The Laura Flanders Show. And after many, many years of doing war corresponding and current affairs, in 2008, I really switched theme and focused on change makers. We say it's now the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. And we make a habit of lifting up models of change, existing models of change in the worlds of arts, politics, and economics. And that means we bring onto our show a lot of people who've never been on TV before, and that's part of the point. But we produce the show with a kind of cohort of colleagues, people who participate, who listen, who are friends and relations, and I am getting to the point, who give us feedback on a regular basis. Like every month we have a 1-hour phone call, and we get a sense of what's happening out in the world and what would make a good show, blah, blah. And we also say, well, can we do something that we're not doing that would be helpful for you? And a few years ago, maybe 8, this group said, well, we would really love media training. If we're going to be on TV, et cetera, it's nice that you give us an opportunity, but we want to do it better. And the training facilities that are out there, especially for television, are totally inaccessible for grassroots activists and not even appropriate when we're talking about appropriate training. So we developed, well, at that time it was a daily show called Grit TV. We developed a Grit TV grassroots training program that we've now done all over the country, my colleague and I, with emphasis on training women of color, grassroots leaders, and they use it, whether they use it for media or not, they use it for leadership in lots of different ways. So all of this is a way to segue to the subject of training and how do we bring out the best talent that is out there that at the end of the day will be what survive our stations. So we have just the right people to talk with about that. At the far end, Kerry Hoffman, CEO of PRX, Kerry Donahue, Director of Training at PRX, and right here, San Wong from the Barr Foundation. Let's just start with some definition of terms. Podcast, what is it?
Sure, I can take that one. One of the things, just to pull on something you just said, so if we think about all the conversations we've had today, what you just said is, it's been an industry declared dead many times, but if you actually widen the aperture and you think about audio and storytelling, et cetera, we're so proud to be part of the long story of radio, community radio, ham radio, HD radio, internet radio, podcasting, and smart speakers. So if you really think about it like that, then you know that podcasting is a word that we use as shorthand for digital audio, but really what we are talking about is audio that's on demand. And so it's what can come. It's actually, think of all of the themes we've heard today about community radio and what it means in the digital age. And for our organization, because people might not be terribly familiar with PRX, but we're a curator and a creator of programs that are both on broadcast, so This American Life, The Moth, On Being, those shows that many people are familiar with in public radio. And we have been in podcasting for many years, and we build technology to support podcasting. And we have a big network called Radiotopia that many people are familiar with, 99% Invisible Criminal. Those people know us through many of those brands. So we kind of have a foot on the boat and a foot on the dock. and what happens in the middle of that is actually training. And that's one of the most important things to talk about today.
Well, let me get to Donahue. So I was going to ask you what PRX is, Public Radio Exchange, but I will ask you how training came to be such a priority.
Well, we actually have a clip that we wanted to play, which might start the story, if that's...
let me just set this up a second. So one of the things that we've heard consistently at every panel today is kind of for the community, by the community. Just think about the mission, et cetera, that we're hearing today. And we've been talking a lot about geographic community, not only in Philadelphia, but like the panel we just heard about what's the global community. And so this clip is about a different kind of community. We hosted a contest a couple of years ago for Radiotopia, and the winner of that was a program called Ear Hustle, and it's about, it's written and produced by prisoners at San Quentin. And so it's that community, and the stories are, the reason why this is such an incredible podcast is that it's not told from the outside, it's told from the inside. Stories of eating, stories of cooking, stories of haircuts, and this clip you're gonna hear is a story about pets, which of course are not allowed in prison. So anyway.
I love animals, oh yeah. Since I've been in prison, I've had black widows, tarantulas, a lot of grasshoppers, beetles.
At San Quentin, inmates aren't allowed to have pets, but some guys get creative, like Roach here.
Gophers, rabbits, I had 4 swallows, a toad, praying mantis, 21 snails, frog, a red-breasted finch whose arm broke, pigeons. I had a desert mole that was partially paralyzed, teddy bear hamster, just really lazy with an attitude, the centipede, and it was a wolf. It was a bad little monster. I had 2 fish that had babies twice. I had a tarantula broke out one time, and my cellie said, "Yo, spider got out." I got into crime for survival, and I was hurting. And I thought it was a way to get back at people. This was the way to make them feel the pain that I felt. Then it slowly became just a part of what I did. I'm incarcerated for 2nd-degree murder. We got in a fight with someone, and I ended up killing him.
You can really feel the power of empathy and storytelling. And so it's safe to say that you don't enter a contest and be able to produce audio like that. You need training, and you need support in that mix. And that's kind of how we really started getting into it.
So what did you do?
Well, I can say, I want to just add for a second that when we know that right now there are about 750,000 podcasts out there, so there's an enormous number of podcasts. We know that about half of the population has listened to one, and that about 30% of the population listens on a regular basis. But what we found is that those access points, the way to get into this is blocked. So I have been teaching radio journalists for a long time, and I think based on what I think of Ear Hustle and this progress, it was a moment for PRX to say, what we really need to do is develop a training program. So we started with the idea that we would, one of the things that we developed first was to have a podcast garage, which is the idea of having a maker space, like a place, we actually have a space in Boston. I think that's the next slide. Sorry.
You're good to do slides backwards. Very good.
Yeah. It is hard to do that backwards. So, and this is, we have other examples, but this was one that I really particularly like, where we have, it's a former Jiffy Lube spot in the neighborhood of Allston in Boston. It's actually a garage. And the idea was that we would make an inexpensive studio, so people would have access to studio space. Just actually sometimes having the ability to get to equipment is one of the barriers for people wanting to make their own content. So it would have an inexpensive studio with staff, encouraging, warm, welcoming staff to help people in this process of becoming a creator. And we also have a classroom where we do trainings and we hold community events. And this is really exciting for PRX, a national organization, to have really deepen our imprint in Boston and to start to look around and say, who would want to come here? Who would want to make stuff in our space? But who else could we partner with in Boston?
I think that's where you came in. Sansa.
So I think one of the things that people may know about Boston is just that it continues to be segregated by neighborhoods. Deep racism that exists there. At the same time, there's like incredible gentrification that's happening. So all of the discussions we were having this morning about how do you build community in place and what's that sense of urgency about storytelling for people who might be displaced came into conversation because we were talking about the virtual nature of podcast, but at the same time, what does it mean to land it? What does it mean to have a physical space and a garage where you're trying to create community? And so I think that's what we began the question about is how do we make this a space that really reflects the changing demographics of Boston, that's really respectful of the stories, that reflects the urgency of the times and the communities that are there. And so we gave PRX almost $500,000 over 2 years to begin a community asset mapping process to really look at what the creative assets were, what some of the challenges were. The training program was also new, and so there was some research that you did around landscape scans and benchmarking of curriculum programs. And it wasn't enough to just do those kind of scans, but we also needed to support PRX in building the capacity of staff, right? So over time, to bring on Kerry, to bring on community engagement folks, we also wanted to help support the partnership development that Kerry was talking about, so that it wasn't just taking place in at the garage, where that sense of people need to come to you versus you actually going out to where they are and really respecting the environments that they live in and the community stories that they have. So that partnership creation and introduction to our grantees that were really embedded in immigrant communities and communities of color. And then I think lastly, it was really about sort of more the curriculum training. And I think what you were talking about in terms of how do you do it on site at the garage, how do you do it online to bring it up to scale, and then how do you do it with community, right? So that there's really impactful community input into the curricular development.
Exactly.
I think, Carrie, you have another slide, is that right?
Well, yeah, this slide. So this shows some of the storytelling work that we've done outside of our physical plant of the Podcast Garage, working with the Powell Art Center in the Chinatown neighborhood in Boston, and with a cafe in the Roxbury neighborhood to get storytelling, to train people over several weeks to tell their own story, and it culminates in a live storytelling event. And then also we just finished last night. First, we're piloting some programs at the Boston Public Library in East Boston and at Cadman Square. And we're looking there for, we put out a call. We actually didn't know. I mean, podcasting is quite hot right now. So we put out a call and said we have these 12 slots. The courses are offered free. Who would come to that? They filled up immediately. And they've been really a terrific experience for people. And we're always looking for that moment. We talk a lot about like what level of interest, for where is someone starting with us? And so we're really looking for people who say, oh, yeah, I know often it's someone who's like, I like podcasting, or I have a story to tell. How to get them at that moment and then give them the skills so that they can then reach the audience. Because back to that 750,000 podcasts out there, it's very hard. An on-demand medium, it has wonderful aspects and limiting aspects. And one of the limiting aspects is it can be hard to find your audience. So we want to keep working on that. One of the wonderful aspects is when you find your audience and they find you, it's really intimate and it's really deeply connected. So, so figuring out how to get people who want to reach a community, who want to have that intimate storytelling, sometimes the anonymity that has been on stage all day, talking about radio, which I love, is a key element to it as well.
So, other Carrie, is this a nonprofit or a for-profit operation? And what about your podcast makers? Are they nonprofits or for-profit?
Yeah, it's everybody. And PRX itself is a nonprofit organization. We were born inside of public media, sort of an R&D arm of public media. But we work with hundreds of independent producers, hundreds of public radio stations. And we are recently doing a project with Google, and we're training teams in other parts of the world on podcasting. The idea is that, podcasting has a low barrier to entry, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. That's an easy mistake to make. And what we find often in digital media is there's a lot of attention in many training programs that are about like how to do a better interview, how to do the craft. And one of the things that Arnetta said this morning, which really stuck with me, is that if you're a young musician today, this is the same if you're a young podcaster today, making a great story isn't the only skill you need to have. You actually need to understand technology in a way that you might not have had access and training. You and I had this conversation earlier, understanding technology, understanding how RSS feeds work around the world, and understanding how to market yourself. These are a skill set that we can really create and shorten that ramp to success, because whether it's podcasting or even radio, we won't be able to change the voices and change the demographics of who's making media unless we actually put training right in the center of that, because that's how you lower that barrier to success and make it more accessible.
And how do you think about place? How do you have, I was thinking, we were talking earlier about local. a lot of local media don't have the capacity to do training locally, but they would like to help their local producers do their local producing better. So I guess my question is, how do you sort of mix those two and provide training for people all over that retains their local feel?
It's a particularly good question because podcasts are interesting. As a longtime radio producer and journalist, I think I've thought of radio as the sense of place and the immediate, where it could be reached with the terrestrial signal. And now with podcasts, they're inherently global. So it's sort of a bit of both in a way in terms of who you can reach. And in training, I think we're very local in the podcast garage, which is really exciting, and we're planning to open more podcast garages over in coming time. But we are also looking to online course development. We're developing a series of podcasting 101 videos that we'll have translated into 5 languages so that we can really expand this. We've been lucky in the past year to be working with Google on the Google Podcast Creator Program, which is an international podcast training program working with independent podcasters. Really terrific teams, like one of our ones currently is called Afro Queer, and they're based in Nairobi, telling stories about queer Africans. And they are doing their own training program. But I think of that, it's opened my mind to think like, well, when someone's out there, wherever they are in the world, and they've got that spark and they say, I really want to figure out how to do this, how can we provide material to them? There are online courses and stuff. I've been studying them all. I think some are good. I have a lot of opinions about them, but I think I think we want to increase the invitation to say to people. Yeah. So it's local and global. It's like and big and small.
And as you said, you're both in charge of kind of the flow and the pipe. You have programs that PRX distributes, or I don't know how you think about it exactly.
Yeah.
And you also have a remix that is sort of the best of some of the podcasts?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we kind of think of it as a pyramid. But what makes the pyramid healthy is the foundation of open access. Podcasting is part of that. We have an open platform where shows like yours also can find their way to stations. And then you have curated, and then you have like the things that we really hold as signature investments, and that's all changing as the media landscape changes. But because there's a lot of people in here who are work at foundations, et cetera, one of the things that was transformative for us in getting the money from the Bar Foundation is that it challenged us to think about this thing that we've been doing all along, which was called customer service, but thinking about it more formally as training, in that accepting and making a stand to say we actually have a lot that we've learned by skinned knees, skinned elbows, and now actually it's time for us to plant those seeds elsewhere, because we were already designed as an open platform. So how do we then take our knowledge and then plant that further, water those seeds deeper, and make a virtuous cycle? And that's really difficult to self-fund. And so by thinking about everything you've just asked, thinking about place, thinking about the role of where you are in your own community. PRX didn't do a lot in Boston, actually, until we had a facility. And now we're really deeply ingrained. So now we think about all of it differently because of training.
So to wrap up, before we go to just a couple of questions from the audience, Sansan, what's next for you, and how do you, the classic metrics question, how do you assess, have they been a good investment? Just between us.
No, I think they've been an incredible investment because of the kinds of stories that have come out. I mean, it just has elevated so many different communities. And to know that you're nurturing that next generation of podcasters and voices, I mean, it's multi-generational investment, really. So
multi-generational investment.
Yeah.
I can hear it, feel it coming. All right, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. Do you want to train up your staff? Do you want to think about podcasting? I know I have questions about how does one think about podcasting if one's used to radio? What's the difference? Yeah, you can ask whatever you want.
You have to sing it.
We're going to sing the answer.
Thank you. So I'm really interested in the concept of taking the training that's already been recorded and repurposing it. And so I was thinking, we were talking at the previous session about globally. Have you thought about ways, or are you repurposing training. So let's say, for example, the Nigerian queers, right? Could that training then be given to, for example, urban young people who are dealing with the same issues, but perhaps maybe it's in English, maybe it's not in English, but just going to different communities, because we've become so globalized that we can find virtually anyone, virtually anywhere. Does that make sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. I'll take the first sentence, but this is really Carrie's specialty. But I'll just say how like we made the turn from that customer service to training, which is that people ask us all the time, what's the great podcast idea? And we never answer that question because we're training people. People have their own stories to tell to their own communities. And so in that way, the training is universal. And we really adhere to that. And we're teaching people to fish. We're very, very clear about that.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, it's a great question, because I think I'm always battling a little bit of a mix of the, high touch, sort of the idea of that sort of, like you could just watch an online course and learn how to do that, and we hope to be making excellent ones, although even the online courses I've envisioned have been less of a MOOC style, though those are helpful, but more of a sort of interactive, maybe not like asynchronous, but something
Coaching.
So that, more of a coaching model. But I would like to get to, we're thinking now beyond, we've had a lot of prototyping since I came on just January last year, and trying out different models. And I think like with the Afro-Queer team, they're doing training in their own community. And it's important to me to think about how to, that train the trainer model that we were hearing. It's like, that feels like it's the right way. So if we can develop curriculum, I've always thought of a pretty open idea about curriculum. It's like, if we could develop something that works, what I think this sort of signature PRX thing is that it's not just craft, that's essential, but it really is this longer arc of how to be successful. Really often thinking about like, who's your intended listener? That is something that we ask a lot, and we really push on the teams who are training to really define and get out there. So because it's very easy to get lost, and because we've had a long tradition, I think, in broadcasting of being like, well, if I just have an excellent idea and I put it out there, the audience will naturally come. And that's kind of, you can get away with some of that when you have a transmitter. You don't get away with that so much with that direct, somebody needs to actually intentionally listen to your podcast. So it's a bit of a mix, and we're forging it right now. So it's a great question.
Samson, did you want to come in on that?
No, no.
Good.
Another question, way in the back, white jacket.
Meet in the middle.
Thank you. So Carrie was my trainer years ago, so I can attest to her skill in that department in school. I was curious whether you all see any commonalities in the podcasts that are most effective, both in identifying audience and deepening relationship with audience, whether that's thematic or whether that's community-wise, or if there's a thread there.
Want to take that one?
Well, I think that the thing to lead with is really empathy. I mean, you really heard that in the Ear Hustle clip. This is changing, but many people listen to podcasts with earphones on, so being sensitive to the fact that it's much more intimate listening than communal listening. But that is changing because so many people own smart speakers or are listening on their desktops, et cetera. So we have to be very mindful to be speaking quite generally to people. I don't know if there's something you want to add to that.
Well, I wish there were, at this moment in podcasting, if there were a terrific formula for, like, here's the type of podcast that works. We've been working with public radio stations on their podcasting strategy for a while. We have a training program called Project Catapult. And it seems like if you're running a public radio station, that, podcasting should come pretty easily in a way, because you already have this expertise with making great audio programs. But what we found is that it's really hard for stations. I mean, there's an opportunity with podcasts where the podcast can help them reach new audience, can help them develop new talent. And there's lots of ways that the podcast can be meaningful to them, but it's still like they need some skill building to get there. And we've seen with the stations that have used podcasts to reach that new audience, that I think that isn't formulaic, and you can say this is the type of audience you can reach, but I think each one is experimenting with that, and that experimentation, they're having various levels of success, things like this, but that experimentation is the part that I keep wanting to foster. It's like a mindset of trying it out. They might find that the first podcast idea doesn't work, or it's time limited, it's episodic and ends, and then they'll try something else next, but that we're kind of building those skills as it goes forward.
And we have to wrap, but just very, very simply, in case we haven't nailed it, are radio stations with transmitters and podcasters in competition for audience? And Sansan, I don't know whether you wanted to.
No.
I think it's a false dichotomy to think of broadcast, and I mean, as I started, I mean, this is all one long trajectory. Technology changes and moves. The stories and the content are actually the center stage, and that's true for broadcast versus podcasts, and we're learning today commercial and non-commercial too. The lines are much more blurred.
Beautiful. Well, that's good, because in the course of this conversation, there's now about 80,000 podcasts.
Yeah, you hear them growing, right?
Carrie, Sansan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.